Ooh. Now, for some reason, hang on. I am frozen. Oh, there you go. Okay. So we talk about Mother Earth, or Sister Mother Earth, if you're a Franciscan. And those are attributes that we often associate with Earth: nurturing, life-giving, fertile, or fertility, barrenness. I'm just going to try and get that off my screen. Sorry. Cool. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. Is that all good? You can see that? Purity, beauty, virginity, nourishing, generosity, all those attributes that we often associate with Earth have also traditionally been associated with women. And as we see this kind of thinking in our language, in our thinking today, so we also see it in biblical thinking and biblical language. So overwhelmingly in the biblical text, the Earth is gendered as female. In the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, the two most common words to speak of Earth, Eretz and Adamah, are both grammatically feminine. And the same is true in the New Testament, where the Greek word for earth, gai, where we get the word Gaia from, is also grammatically feminine. And again, the imagery associated with earth in the Bible is, again, stereotypically associated with women. So we get that kind of fertility, barrenness, nurturing, life-giving, virginal, untamed, wild, fruitful, desolate, polluted, economically valuable, and so on. In particular, we see imagery of sexual violation used in relation to both women and earth, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. But basically, the identity of women and the identity of earth in the biblical text in particular is very closely tied together, is intertwined. It's kind of inextricably intertwined in both contemporary times in our own day, but also in biblical texts as well. So on one level, this is really obvious. It resonates with our own understanding, our own thinking, our own experience of women and earth. But on another level, this connection is problematic, and it's led to the oppression and exploitation of both women and earth. So we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. And it leads us to ecofeminist analysis, which, broadly speaking, critically explores the connection between the oppression of women and the domination of earth. And I'm assuming, I think, that probably lots of you know lots about ecofeminism. But for the purposes of the kōrero today, I just want to touch really briefly on what's probably the most significant contribution of ecofeminism, which is exposing and critiquing the hierarchical dualisms, which enable what's called the logic of domination, which connects the oppression of women and earth. So it's a little bit jargony, and to unpack those ideas a little bit more, dualistic thinking basically is a way of thinking that understands the world in opposites or pairs. And I've got a list there. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's kind of just an example. Now, so it sees the world in opposites and in pairs. So each pair is seen as separate from, but in relationship to its opposite. Now, on one level, this kind of thinking is clearly flawed. It's very reductionist. It reduces everything to a binary. It's either or kind of thinking, which we know that either or thinking doesn't reflect the complexity and the diversity and the blurry, fuzzy beauty of our world. But it's also flawed because it's hierarchically charged. which means that everything on the so-called superior side of the pair, that's the left-hand side of the column, of the two columns there, is seen as having power and priority over the inferior side of the pair. So God, for example, is understood as being separate from, superior to, and having power over earth. Similarly, by that kind of rationale, men are seen as being separate from, superior to, and having power over women. And human beings, similarly, are seen as being separate from, superior to, and having power over our surrounding environment. And from these hierarchically separated categories comes the logic of domination, which says that with superiority comes the right to rule or to dominate. So domination is seen as both justified and natural, and we get from this a whole bunch of oppressions and exclusions which are justified by this unspoken but nonetheless very real logic of domination. But things get even more tricky, because these two different and distinct categories, those columns there, are mutually reinforcing. So the superior term of each pair, those terms in the column on the left, come to be associated with the superior term of other pairs. So, for example, God comes to be closely associated with maleness, with the spiritual realm, with the mind, with civilization, with goodness, and so on. And this is also true for the inferior terms as well. Those on the right-hand column in the square there, earth comes to be closely associated with women, the physical realm, kind of the material world, animals, the body, uncivilization, evil, and so on. And because these connections are mutually reinforcing, the presence of one of these terms on the inferior side of the dualisms both reinforces and is reinforced by its association with the other terms. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. So, for example, we'll look at earth and women. The feminization of earth, understanding earth in female terms, reinforces earth's place on the inferior side of the dualistic pairing. And the environmentalization of women, or thinking of women in earthy terms, reinforces women's place on the inferior side of the dualistic pairing. So it's quite a vicious and violent cycle. And it's a complex and pervasive web of interlocking relationships of power and oppression, essentially. And these structures of thought in the West, at least, combine to form implicit systems of belief, which are reflected in our attitudes and in our behavior, in our theologies, and in our biblical interpretations. So when we read the Bible thinking about the relationship between women and earth, we're paying attention to these intersectional dynamics, both in the biblical text itself, but also in our interpretation of the biblical text. So there's quite a lot going on there. So how do we bring this analysis into our reading of the Bible? How do we think with women and earth when we read the Bible? How does it shape, or how do they shape or influence how we read the text? And I'm sure you know that feminist readings of the Bible center or privilege the presence and experience of women in both the text itself and in the lives of the reader. And similarly, in ecological readings of the Bible, the earth and other than human characters are put in the center of the interpretation, and questions are asked of its presence there. So earth and other than human inhabitants are reframed as characters in the text. They're not the background against which the human divine drama plays out. They are characters with inherent worth, with agency, with subjectivity, and they're understood as having a voice that can be raised in celebration and praise, which can be heard resisting violence and injustice as well. Obviously, feminist interpretation is older. It's much more well known. Ecological interpretation of biblical texts is in its infancy, but it is getting more airtime, particularly in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. But here we are centering or paying attention to both earth and women, in particular earth as woman, because they're so often fused or bound together. The fate of one is caught up with the fate of the other. So let's have a look at some examples from the biblical text. And there are, of course, and these images will probably be quite familiar to you. There are the more well-known examples where women and earth, or the feminine and earths other than human creatures, appear fused in more positive contexts. In Hosea 13, for example, God is imaged as an angry mother bear. And in Matthew 23, Jesus images himself as a mother hen who gathers her brood protectively under her wings. Now, for some, these images are problematic because they perpetuate traditional ideals and experiences and in expectations of femininity. So they perpetuate ideas and uphold ideals of motherhood, protection, and care. For others, these images offer profound insight into God's character, insights which resonate with readers and offer an alternative to the male-dominated imagery that's so prevalent in the Christian tradition. So however you kind of feel about these images, it's interesting to note that they're very rarely used in our common language for God and our common thinking about God. More frequently, though, in biblical texts, the connection between women and earth is more problematic. In the prophets, for example, we often find imagery depicting a really complex fusion of bodies, where earth or land becomes a metaphor for a woman's body, which in turn is a metaphor for society, for the social body. So there's a whole mixture of bodies going on. There are quite a few examples of this. We often read about, for example, daughter Zion. And so here, Zion, the physical land space, but also the people who inhabit that land space, are imagined as a woman who is a daughter. Similarly, we have daughter Babylon, again, referring to Babylon, both the place and the people, who are also depicted as daughter. We have other examples, the wicked sisters, Israel and Judah, and the daughters Jerusalem and Samaria. So you can see there's this quite complex fusion of bodies in a multi-layered metaphor, if you like. And these images are so common throughout the biblical text that we don't often stop to unpack them and work out what's going on at various levels of the imagery. And when we do, it can be quite troubling. Often when this kind of imagery is used, we see descriptions of human indiscretion, so human wrongdoing, transferred onto the bodies of both women and land. So human sinfulness or disobedience to God is often talked about in terms of bad behavior of a woman or girl who is also the land. And so often this bad behavior is described in terms of sexual deviance. In Jeremiah 3, for example, the people of Israel's unfaithfulness to God is described in terms of a woman who's taken many lovers and whose promiscuity has polluted the land that is Israel. So we have look up to the bare heights and see, where have you, Israel, the place and the people, not been laid with? By the waysides you have sat waiting for lovers, like a nomad in the wilderness. You have polluted the land with your whoring and wickedness. So you can see that when we look closely at that text, there's a whole lot of bodies being drawn upon in order to make a point. And they're kind of all fused together. Then in turn, the punishment for this wickedness, which is ultimately directed at the people, the social body, is inflicted on the bodies of women and land. And as we just saw, the human wrongdoing is often talked about in terms of sexual deviance. The punishment for this wrongdoing is also often talked about in terms of sexual violence, carried out not on the bodies of the people, but on the bodies of women and earth. So again, another example here from Jeremiah. You can tell that I really like Jeremiah. It's from Jeremiah 13, where the people of Judah and Jerusalem specifically, the physical land space, they're imagined as a woman who is punished by having her skirts lifted up and being violently violated. So we read there, if you, Jerusalem, the place and the people, say in your heart, why have these things come upon me? It is for the greatness of your iniquity that your skirts are lifted up and you are violated. I myself will lift up your skirts over your face, and your shame will be seen. I have seen your abominations, your adulteries, your naying, your shameless prostitutions on the hills of the countryside. Woe to you, Jerusalem, and so on. So we have punishment against the people, which is violently inflicted upon the land as a woman. Now, these images are particularly prevalent in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, but we also find that the fate of women and land is bound together in the New Testament as well. In the book of Revelation, for example, we find the image of the so-called Great Whore of Babylon. So again, it's a complex metaphor. Where Rome, the place and imperial authority, so the people, and Babylon, the place and imperial authority, the people, are depicted as a great whore, indeed the mother of whores, who commits fornication and embodies earth's abominations. And of course, this woman, who is also Rome, the place and the people, and Babylon, the place and the people, will inevitably experience punishment and destruction, which again evokes sexual violence. So she, the woman, the place and the people will, and the text tells us, will be made desolate and naked, with her flesh devoured and burned with fire. It's pretty intense imagery. It's pretty complex imagery, but it's also pretty intense, violent imagery. So they're metaphors that work on lots of levels at once, but the metaphor relies on a close relationship between the bodies of women and the body of earth, and the blurring between these different layers of the metaphors. Now, just to finish up, I want to ask, does any of this actually matter? These are, after all, just metaphors. They're just words and images. In theory, they're harmless, right? And on one level, these are just words on the page. They are images that provoke us into thinking and perhaps behaving differently. But on another level, these words and images are also giving us messages about ourselves and the world we live in. So one of the questions I often ask my students is, what are these words and images, these metaphors, telling us about the world in which we live? What do these words tell us about the character of women? Is the message here one that women are inherently connected to sin and infidelity and sexual deviance? What do these words tell us about the character of earth? Do they normalize the idea that earth is little more than a pawn in the divine human drama, and similarly associated with sin and temptation? And related to that is a further question around what kind of world these texts are inviting us to inhabit. Is it a world in which sexual violence is an acceptable form of punishment, given the right, in scare quotes, given the right circumstances? Is this a world in which the violent wholesale destruction of Earth and Earth's inhabitants is acceptable or necessary even? Do these words and images provide a conceptual basis for domination in its various forms? Because words, and in particular sacred words, have huge power to shape our reality, to shape the way we see the world, to shape the way we behave in the world. They have the power to define what is normal, what is acceptable, in terms of the way that we relate to each other and the world around us. And for our intents and purposes here, the way that we think about and the way we relate to women and earth. So in that sense, texts have the power to create and the power to destroy. The Bible has the power to act and impact the lived experience of readers. Readers who engage with biblical texts and then embody the ideas of these texts in the world. And so we need to be careful and critical, I think, of accepting at face value some of the ideas of the metaphors held within these texts, which hold profoundly problematic and dangerous ideologies, particularly about women and earth. And so finally, I asked my students to take their questioning one step further and ask, what kind of world is the text inviting us to inhabit? And does that world embody Jesus' imperatives of justice and compassion? Are we happy inhabiting a world where these ideas